All right, so are you ready to step back in time a little bit? We're gonna do a deep dive on 3 Mile Island today, and not just like the actual incident, but like everything that led up to it,
Yeah.
the meltdown in '79.
Oh, yeah.
And we have a really cool source for this deep dive. It's an episode of the American Scandal podcast, and they use these like dramatic reenactments.
Oh, wow.
It's really cool. It's like a very immersive. You feel like you're right there in the control room with the guys.
Yeah. It's one thing to just like read the facts, but to actually hear the voices and like the tension in the room,
Yeah.
it really puts you right there.
Totally. So our mission for this deep dive is to understand not just like what happened, but like why. How did this chain of events, all the miscommunications, the equipment problems, how did it all like snowball into this huge crisis?
It's a classic example of how like these small problems, if they're not addressed, can really escalate into something much, much worse.
Yeah.
And in this case, the stakes were incredibly high.
Totally. Okay, so picture this. It's the 1970s. America's in the middle of this big energy crisis.
Right. Gas prices are through the roof, and there's this huge push to find alternatives to oil.
Nuclear power, with its promise of all this cheap and abundant energy. It seemed like the answer at the time.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, this is less than 40 years after the atomic bombs. So the public was understandably nervous about this whole nuclear thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's still kind of like tied in with the fear of nuclear war.
Oh, absolutely.
And then to make things even worse, the movie The China Syndrome comes out just 12 days before 3 Mile Island.
Oh, wow. Talk about bad timing.
I know, right?
A film about a nuclear meltdown just feeding into all his fears about nuclear safety, and then this real-life incident happens.
It's crazy how that all lined up. So it's March 28th, 1979 at 3 Mile Island. And it seems like a pretty routine maintenance issue pops up. Clogged water filters.
Sounds simple enough.
Yeah. But the episode does a great job of capturing how, like, the whole atmosphere at the plant changes.
Yeah. And they introduce us to these two operators, Fred Shyman and Don Biller. They're the ones who first discover the problem. And all 8 filter machines shut down. And it gets like eerily quiet in the plant.
Really?
Yeah, usually there's like this symphony of sounds from all the machinery.
I describe it as the symphony of pumps and motors.
Yeah, and then suddenly, silence.
Wow.
And it really foreshadows the chaos that's about to happen.
That's like the calm before the storm.
Right. Okay, so, of course, things go downhill pretty fast. The emergency water system fails. Then the reactor shuts down automatically, and the temperature in the boiler starts to climb really fast.
It's that whole cascade effect.
Uh-huh.
One failure triggering another.
Huh.
Like it creates this chain reaction that's almost impossible to stop.
And then we meet Bill Zwi. He's the graveyard shift supervisor.
Yeah.
And amidst all these alarms going off, he's surprisingly calm.
Mm.
Maybe too calm.
Well, he's trained for these situations.
Yeah.
You know, the episode portrays him as very methodical, trying to make sense of all the data coming in. But you can tell that he knows that something is seriously wrong.
Yeah. And then they discover another issue. A valve that's supposed to be open is closed.
Oh, no.
It had been closed for maintenance, but it was never reopened.
Hmm.
It seems like a small oversight, but
But in a system as complex as a nuclear reactor,
yeah,
even the smallest things can have huge consequences.
exactly. And this closed valve, it restricted the water flow to the boilers,
Oh, wow.
so it just made things worse. And then on top of all that, the instrument readings start giving conflicting information.
What?
Yeah, coolant levels are showing high and low at the same time.
Oh, my God.
Can you imagine the confusion?
It would be a nightmare. Trying to solve a problem when the instruments are giving you bad information.
It's like your tools are working against you.
Yeah, and that's when human error can really come into play.
Yeah.
Especially under that kind of pressure.
And Zui realizes at this point that this is no longer just a routine issue. This is a full-blown crisis.
Right.
And he makes the decision to call in Gary Miller, the plant supervisor. And we get this really vivid description of Miller driving to the plant. It's the middle of the night. He's anxious. He wants to prove himself, but he has no idea what he's about to walk into.
And a lot of people considered Miller to be a rookie. So he's got this added pressure to perform.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
So they're all trying to figure out what's going on. But then they run into another major problem, the pilot-operated relief valve, or PORV as they call it.
Okay.
And this thing is designed to release pressure from the reactor.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This valve has a history of sticking open. It's a known defect, according to the podcast. And the episode points out that Babcock and Wilcox, the company that designed the plant, they kind of downplayed this flaw.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's almost like they were saying, oh yeah, it sticks sometimes, but it's no big deal.
But is it ever no big deal when you're talking about a nuclear reactor?
That's the question, right? Was this negligence, or were they just completely underestimating the danger here?
It's a theme that comes up again and again in this story. The danger of downplaying risks when you're dealing with complex technology.
Totally. So they send someone to manually check the PRV, and what do you know? It's closed.
So it's not that.
Nope. The plot thickens. But just when you think it can't get any worse,
What happens?
radiation alarms start going off in the auxiliary building.
Oh my.
And that's the moment they realize this is not a drill. This is real. Radiation is escaping.
Wow.
And they make the decision to declare a site emergency. There's no turning back now.
Okay, so we left off with those radiation alarms going off. A site emergency declared at 3 Mile Island. It's not just an issue at the plant anymore. Now the whole surrounding area is at risk.
Right. It goes from like this contained technical problem to a full-blown public crisis.
And as the operators are dealing with this potential meltdown, news of the incident starts spreading. And the American Scandal episode introduces us to Mike Pint. He's a news director at this local radio station, WKBO.
And he's one of the first journalists to pick up on this story. And he's trying to piece together what's going on, but getting accurate info is tough.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. This is 1979. No internet.
Yeah.
No social media.
Yeah.
People are relying on radio and TV for updates.
Exactly. And the official word from Metropolitan Edison, the company that owns the plant, is that there's no immediate danger to the public.
But is that really the whole story?
That's what Mike Plain's trying to figure out. He wants answers, but he keeps running into these roadblocks and conflicting information.
It really shows how a lack of communication can make a crisis even worse.
Totally. And in this case, it's not just about the technical stuff. It's about managing public perception, fear, panic.
Right, perception is everything.
So while Mike's trying to get the scoop, the governor of Pennsylvania, Dick Thornburg, he has to make this impossible decision, whether or not to order a mass evacuation.
Wow, that's a heavy burden.
I know, hundreds of thousands of lives are at stake, but he's got limited information. Experts are giving him conflicting advice. And there's the whole issue of causing mass panic and economic chaos if he does order an evacuation.
It's a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, if he evacuates and it turns out to be unnecessary, he looks like he overreacted.
Right.
But if he downplays the risk and people get hurt, the consequences could be catastrophic.
And on top of that, the scientific community is totally divided on how dangerous this radiation exposure really is.
Right. Some experts are saying, evacuate now, while others are like, no, the levels are low. It's not an immediate threat.
So who do you trust?
Exactly. It just shows how even the smartest people can disagree, especially when there's so much uncertainty.
And then to add even more pressure, President Carter gets involved.
Oh, yeah.
And he sends Harold Benton, this top nuclear engineer from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to 3 Mile Island.
Denton's supposed to be like the expert, the voice of reason.
Okay.
He's there to assess the situation, advise the governor, and hopefully help contain this whole mess.
So he's the guy with all the answers.
Well, not exactly. Even Benton is kind of overwhelmed at first. The episode describes him being bombarded with information, a lot of it contradictory.
So what does he do?
He's like a detective trying to solve this puzzle, where the pieces keep changing.
That's a good way to put it.
And as he starts digging, Denton realizes that things are much worse than Metropolitan Edison has been letting on.
Oh, no.
Yeah. There's evidence that a partial meltdown might have already happened.
Wow, that changes everything.
Yeah, the stakes just got a lot higher. And it puts more pressure on Governor Thornburg to make a decision about that evacuation.
Right.
Meanwhile, back at the plant, the operators are still battling to control the reactor.
Yeah.
They're trying to cool it down, stabilize the pressure, but they're basically flying blind.
You really get a sense of their exhaustion in the episode. They're in over their heads.
They're working nonstop, no sleep, making decisions that could have huge consequences. It's a recipe for disaster.
It's a good reminder that these are people, not robots.
Yeah, they have limits, and they're under so much stress.
It really highlights that human element in these technological disasters.
So under all this pressure, Governor Thornburg makes the tough call. He recommends a partial evacuation.
Okay.
Pregnant women and young children within 5 miles of the plant are told to leave.
It's like a compromise.
Right.
Trying to balance public safety with not causing widespread panic.
But it causes a lot of confusion and anger in the community.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, people are being told to leave their homes, but they don't know why or for how long.
Right. It's scary and frustrating. They see their community in chaos, and they feel like they're being kept in the dark.
It shows the ripple effects of these kinds of events.
Yeah.
It's not just the immediate danger, it's the social, economic, psychological impact on the community.
It reminds you that these technological disasters, they're not just abstract concepts, they have very real human consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a partial evacuation underway, a community in turmoil, and a team of experts who are still trying to figure out how bad this situation really is.
And at the center of it all, the reactor is still volatile.
Yeah, this thing is far from over. So last time we left things on a bit of a cliffhanger. A partial evacuation is happening, and the team at 3 Mile Island is working like crazy to get that reactor under control. But like the American Scandal episode points out, the danger goes beyond just the radiation threat at that moment.
Yeah. What really freaked people out was the unknown. You know, like, what are the long-term effects of radiation exposure that was, and still is, a huge source of anxiety.
Right. It's like this fear of the invisible.
Yeah.
And back then, as the crisis is unfolding, people are glued to their radios and TVs, just desperate for any information. I bet the rumors were flying.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Uncertainty leads to all kinds of misinformation.
Yeah.
And in this case, the authorities weren't exactly doing a great job of communicating clearly.
Right. They kept changing their story.
Yeah.
And Metropolitan Edison, the company that owns the plant,
Yeah.
they just kept downplaying how serious the situation was. Looking back, it's no wonder the public lost trust so quickly.
I mean, trying to avoid panic is one thing, but at a certain point, it just becomes irresponsible, doesn't it?
Totally. It makes you wonder about their priorities. Were they more concerned with protecting their image than with being honest with people?
Right. What were they really thinking?
So while everyone's trying to figure out what to believe, Harold Denton and his team are facing a whole other kind of pressure. They've got to stabilize that reactor. But how do you even begin to deal with a partial meltdown? That's not exactly something they teach you in school.
Yeah, this was like uncharted territory. There's no manual, no step-by-step guide for a situation like this. It's like trying to defuse a bomb you've never seen before.
And every hour that passes, the risk of a full meltdown gets bigger, and the potential consequences are just devastating. Talk about pressure. These guys are working nonstop, sleep-deprived, making these life-or-death decisions.
The episode does a great job of showing the toll this whole thing took on the people involved, the crazy working conditions, the weight of responsibility these engineers and operators had on their shoulders.
So what was the plan? How did they actually get things under control?
It was this whole multi-pronged approach. They had to slowly bring down the pressure inside the reactor, at the same time cool down the core. And one of the biggest problems was this massive hydrogen bubble that had formed inside the reactor vessel.
Oh, yeah, I remember that being mentioned. It sounded terrifying.
Hydrogen is super flammable.
Right.
If that bubble had ignited, it could have caused this huge explosion,
Yeah.
potentially breaking through the containment structure and releasing a ton of radiation.
It's like they were sitting on a time bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they couldn't just vent the hydrogen quickly, because that could have caused a sudden pressure drop, which would have destabilized the reactor even more. They had to be super careful.
So how did they get rid of this hydrogen bubble without blowing everything up?
It took days.
Mm.
But they carefully monitored the situation, vented the hydrogen strategically, and used their expertise to make adjustments as they went. And eventually they were able to shrink that bubble
Yeah.
and eliminate the risk of an explosion.
That sounds like a combination of skill, ingenuity, and a whole lot of luck.
Definitely. It really shows the dedication and expertise of those people who worked so hard to prevent a total disaster.
So they prevent a full-on meltdown, but the story doesn't end there. What about the long-term effects? Did they ever figure out what caused this whole mess in the first place?
There were a bunch of investigations, and they basically concluded that it was this perfect storm of factors: mechanical failures, human error, design flaws in the reactor itself, and importantly, a culture that just didn't take these potential problems seriously enough.
We talked about that faulty PRV earlier. It's crazy to think that such a small part could cause such a huge problem.
It's easy to focus on just one piece of equipment, but the reality is that this was a failure of the whole system. Yeah, the PRV sticking open was a big factor. But the investigations also found that the operators weren't trained properly, that there were communication breakdowns, and that the nuclear industry as a whole had become complacent.
So it was like all these small failures that added up to one giant near catastrophe.
That's the big lesson here. 3 Mile Island wasn't just an accident. It was a wake-up call. It forced the industry to reevaluate its safety standards, tighten up regulations, and improve their emergency plans.
And how did it affect public perception of nuclear power? I can't imagine it was good for the industry.
It was a huge setback. The anti-nuclear movement got a lot stronger after 3 Mile Island. There was more scrutiny of the industry, and the public became even more wary. of nuclear plants.
It really shows how technology, no matter how advanced it is only as good as the people who create it, use it, and regulate it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. 3 Mile Island is this cautionary tale about how important it is to be careful, transparent, and have a strong culture of safety when you're dealing with these powerful technologies that can have such a huge impact.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into 3 Mile Island. It's a story of failures, human error, and the fear that surrounds nuclear power.
But it's also a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the dedication of those who worked to prevent a much bigger disaster.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative. Until next time, stay curious.